I have the fantastic pleasure and privilege of inviting you and welcoming you into this course on the research frontiers and the digitalization of society. It's going to be a fantastic ride. We'll be going throughout the summer, and you will be exposed to fantastic researchers, all hailing from the Department of Applied IT at the University of Gothenburg. This department is currently ranked as one of the top five in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We are also part of the Swedish Center for Digital Innovation, which is ranked as number one of the top three research environments in the world when it comes to digital innovation and digital transformation. So we've been able to gather fantastic individuals for you, fantastic research projects at the very cutting edge of the digitalization of society. But before we get into the course, I would just like to, welcome you aboard, but also give you some sort of framing or an attempt at a framing of this area of interest, right? So when we're talking about the digitalization of society, we're talking about the influx of digital technologies into our everyday lives, right? And we're talking about the implications of this, how this changes things. And when we have studied these things in the past, we've noticed that, as these technologies emerge and as the use of these technologies evolves, we have a tendency to sort of over time forget about them. They sort of seep into the everyday nooks and crannies of our reality. It becomes perfectly natural for you to interact with a television, with a smartphone, with a microwave oven, right? So in the beginning, when these technologies are introduced into society, we're a little bit afraid of them. They are a little bit mysterious. They are something apart from our everyday lives. But as these technologies mature, they become part of our everyday life. And this is something that previous research has identified, such as, sort of in the words of Mark Weiser, we can see here. So the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. And wouldn't you agree that that's what's currently happening to digital technologies? But if we think about that, it also means that as long as we talk about a technology, a specific technology like artificial intelligence, for instance, then it doesn't really have an effect. It is first when we stop talking about it, when it is basically natural, when it's normalized, that it actually has an effect. So the study of digital technologies is also the study of sort of things that do not matter at the time, but might matter in the future. And just to give you an introduction to that, or some sort of framing into it, I would like to show you this. So this technology that we're talking about, or this class of technologies, digital technologies, they are evolving at what is referred to as an exponential pace. So it evolves swifter and swifter and faster. So the development between the 1950s and 2010 was dramatic. Right? I don't know if you were alive back then or if you were active in the industry, but for those of you that were, you'll remember a time when technology was constantly forcing us to reinvent ourselves. New tech came into the workplace, it changed our processes. It came into our everyday lives, changed our everyday life and our way of interacting, right? So it was an enormous pace. But of course, it wasn't the same pace as we are experiencing today. And as human beings, we have a hard time understanding the exponential. We are very linear. We are evolutionary, not revolutionary, right? But what we know is that, in around 2010, we see a shift. We see a shift into what we now refer to as platform strategies. So organizations started externalizing value creation through the use of digital technologies. It was now possible to get somebody else to do the job for you, like Google, right? They could actually set up an extremely profitable business by getting all of us to engage as factory workers, right? To search and train their algorithms for free, to click and work for sales for free, right? The entirety of their business model was built on this fantastic means of externalizing value creation or value co-creation and then capturing it centrally. Companies like Airbnb and Uber, they were externalizing quality reviews, etc., etc. Companies like Apple were externalizing the development of the apps for the iPhone, right, and making a fantastic profit on it. So the most capitalized firms in the world immediately became these platform firms. They showed an exponential growth. They had network effects and they tapped into those, which put them aside from all of their competitors immediately. So we refer to that as platform strategies or multi-sided market strategies or ways in which we can combine economies of scale and economies of scope there. But it was only in retrospect that we actually knew what to call it. And from my perspective, this is the beginning of the digital transformation or the digitalization. I will use those two terms interchangeably, right? And that went on until late 2022 or beginning of 2023 when OpenAI introduced ChatGPT. And it triggered an enormous reaction, right? Our researchers focused on AI. They thought that this was years in the future before this would happen, before we would have this maturity in terms of the generative AI. We refer to it as generative AI now, but we really don't know what we will refer to it as in retrospect. But it had an enormous effect, an enormous change. It was a disruptive event, forcing old incumbent technology vendors to basically start to reinvent themselves or die in the process, triggering a lot of regulation from the EU, right? It made a mess. And the only thing we know is that the next sort of phase in this technology's development, in the digital technology development, is something that we at present have no way of guessing. Right? The only thing that we know is that this period of time, the 13 years between 2010 and 2023, the next sort of quantum leap will not take 13 years. It will be shorter. And the disruptive effects or the transformative impact of that new technology will by far be greater than that of the introduction of generative AI. What we know from research is that during this period, we've seen an increase in what is referred to as digital intensity. So firms spend more and more of their revenues on digital and IT. Right? So they are becoming more and more, changing the capital structure of these organizations, regardless if they're public sector organizations or private organizations. So they are changing or they are replacing hands with algorithms, right? And that refers back to not having to spend that much money on personnel, but having to spend more money on the technology per se. We also know that this triggers market dynamism. So the more you spend on digital, the more dependent you are on this critical resource, the higher the pace of fluctuation in the market will be. The higher the performance spread, i.e. the difference between the best and the second best will be. The higher the risk will be for the organizations that are acting in this environment, because the demands to stay relevant for these organizations, they increase in terms of fluctuation. They become less and less safe and stable. So we enter into an environment where we increasingly will be reliant on resilience rather than robustness, on being able to change swiftly and develop swiftly. Unfortunately, we have a legacy in place. So we have a legacy in terms of governance, i.e. the setting for management, the ways in which we handle and make decisions in our organizations that stems back to the, turn of the millennia. Then we set in place these governance frameworks that guide us in terms of making decisions related to IT. And that's a really bad idea. They aren't designed to reap the rewards of generative AI or whatever is coming after, right? They are designed to work in the year 2000 with the technology that we had back then, with the way that the organization looked, with the way that these organizations needed to adapt to changes in the outside environment, right? In a time of polycrisis, with sustainability challenges, with digital challenges, with geopolitical challenges, with, changes all around. Now, we will need to act faster. Then we will see that this governance that we have in place doesn't really afford that for us, right? And we also have a digital legacy in place, a technological legacy. We have old, antiquated systems that weren't designed to integrate with generative AI or to be as swift in development as we have to be today. So, regardless of the pace of technological development, our organizations display very high levels of inertia, very low levels of adaptability. And that is something that we are increasingly becoming aware that we need to change in the future. So, if we just look at what this means and what this will increasingly mean in the future, we can have a look at what the World Economic Forum prophesizes. And I'm using the word prophesize here because, well, the science is a little bit obscure behind this. But at least according to them, we'll see 70% of all financial value in the coming decade having been created through these digital platform business models. Right? So we are extremely dependent on this if we want to succeed, if we want to compete. We are going to have to tap into the digital. We also see from research in Poland that, well, 87% of these sustainable development goals, they set parameters and they require digital government at the highest maturity level, right? So this means that our underlying infrastructure and the way that we govern technology and the way that we utilize digital actually matters if we want to achieve a green transition, for instance, or a just society. So we are dependent on this technology. It's not just sort of gadgets and fun things that we can play around with. It is part of the very infrastructure on which we build our welfare state, on which we build our future. And it also means that, well, as organizations increasingly become dependent on these technologies, certain things start to pop up. We see certain patterns emerging. The first pattern we see is that, well, the organizational boundary doesn't really matter to the same extent as it did in the past. This is something that was identified already in the 1970s by Jensen and Meckling. But we now see that the organization, the firm, is a legal fiction. Most of the value is created through services, i.e. they are created a value in use by clients, by customers, right? By citizens. That's where the value is created. It isn't created internally in the organization. And that means that these boundaries, they become semi-permeable. They become porous, right? They're no longer as important as they were in the past. So we increasingly see ecosystems of organizational actors working together, co-opting, right? We see within the digitalization of the public sector, we see collective digital transformation emerging. So a lot of fantastic, interesting things happen when the organizational boundary becomes semi-permeable. We also see that this impacts organizations in the way that, well, the former hierarchies become less prevalent and become less relevant for the organization. Setting your organization up in a very hierarchical manner really clashes with the idea of digital, with the radical decentralization of agency. So here, technology is challenging the internal logics of the organizations as well, not only their boundaries. And last but not least, it is challenging institutions. Institutions like banks. Why would I need a bank to know how much money I have when there's crypto? A completely decentralized manner in which I can actually understand. I don't need the bank. I don't need a bank office. I need banking services, right? I need travel services, but not a travel agent. See, etc., etc. So all of these, or a lot of these previous institutions, they start to crumble. So this technology per se is an institutional killer. So massive changes But then it's good that we have research, right? Fantastic research that allows us to know what we're getting into, how our charted territory, so to speak. And if we look at, this is research from Harvard, from MIT, where they look at, well, how will AI influence three key aspects of macroeconomic side? Now, well, in terms of productivity growth, it might go into higher productivity growth or lower productivity growth. In terms of income inequality, it might lead to an increase in income inequality or a decrease in income inequality. In terms of industrial concentration, well, it might increase it or it might decrease it. So what I'm trying to say here is, this is ongoing research. We still don't know what the implications of these technologies are. Yeah, so we have to continue looking. And this course will give you access to those individuals that are actually paid to do that work, to try to understand this very frontier of insight. Last but not least, before we enter sort of a discussion or a presentation of the course itself, I want to give you this. This is work by Vessel. Now, contrasting the way in which we used to work with technology against the way in which we now increasingly use technology and work with technology. In the old world, we had IT-enabled organizational transformation. This is what we built our IT organizations to do, to implement enterprise resource planning systems and then sort of support, increase operational excellence, but continue to do basically what we were doing previously, but with less resources. So it was basically only a reinforcing of the organizational identity. It wasn't that challenging, really. It was hard, I'll give you that. But it wasn't challenging the underlying logic. It wasn't bringing new value offerings into the onto the table. But digital transformation in the new world is actually creating new organizational identities. It is transforming these organizations, not just optimizing them, but transforming them into something new. It's a chrysalis process where we don't really know what will come out, because it's generative. So that is some sort of backdrop, some sort of an attempt at a backdrop anyway. So let's look at the learning objectives of this course. So after this course is done, you will have knowledge, competence, and judgment according to the following. In terms of knowledge, you'll be able to describe central and emerging theories associated with the digitalization of society, as well as use current terminology and contemporary issues within the digitalization of society. In terms of competence and skills, you're able to present and discuss the effects of research findings and alternative perspectives on the digitalization of society. And in terms of judgment and approach, then you'll be able to independently argue for and against different perspectives on the digitalization of society, with clear references to the research literature, as well as evaluate and assess the effects of research findings and perspectives on the digitalization of society. So this is what you need to reach in terms of knowledge, competence, and judgment if you want to pass on this course. But to give you a little bit more of a detailed description of what the course will entail, it is basically just a flow of lectures, papers, and discussions and quizzes. Right? So we've organized it into a couple of modules. These modules are organized on account of the research that we have access to here in Gothenburg. So we'll start with a module on artificial intelligence, because there is a lot of things happening around this. And after that, we'll continue to a module on responsibility. So looking into the ethical aspects related to this. What happens when these algorithms come into play? What happens when we automate decision making in, for instance, social services? Now, after that, we'll move on to technology, looking deeper into technologies like blockchain to understand these emerging technologies. After that, we'll move over to strategies, looking into how organizations work with formulating and implementing strategies related to this. And last but not least, we'll get into twin transition. So the parallel and dual and codependent digital and green transitions that are going on now. So that's what we're going to do. And as you see in this slide, we have set dates on when these modules will open up. When the module opens up, the lectures, the readings, the quizzes, and the discussions will be made available to you. And your job is to engage heavily in these discussions then. Read the material, right? Yeah, look at the lectures a couple of times and participate in these discussions. Now, and you need to make substantive contributions, more than 5 in each module discussion, right, to get a passing grade. That's one of the ways in which we assess you in this course. But it's also a very integral part of the formative learning that you will be engaging in. Right? You will help each other understand this. You will be in groups discussing these things. It will be asynchronous, but you will sort of go back and forth with other fantastic individuals that are super interested in this field, right? And then we've also added quizzes, both for formative assessment and for making it possible for you to go to the next module. So before you can enter the new model, even if it has been published, before you can start taking part of it, you have to get a pass on the quiz. You can do it as many times as you like, but you have to get a pass. Then you will have access to the next module, right? So we've designed this to get you as engaged as possible, and we really hope you do so. So try to keep up the pace and try to keep up your engagement, and then everything will be fantastic. So if there's any question whatsoever, please direct it to the Canvas site. There's a Q&A there. Have a look through that and see if you can find the answer to your question. Otherwise, you post it in that discussion forum. And with that, I just want to wish you the warmest welcome again. It's going to be a fantastic ride. You'll get to meet a lot of interesting people, both in terms of the teachers and researchers and in terms of the other students participating in this course. And I hope that by the end of the summer, you'll have a really, really good grasp of where the research frontier actually is, where we still don't know, but where we actually have sound research and sound scientific evidence that can guide you in making better decisions related to digital transformation. With that, I leave you, and once again, a warm welcome. Bye-bye.